The Earth, in its ceaseless, patient revolution around the sun, marks the passage of time. Each year, a new chapter in the long and often turbulent history of our planet. The year 2008 began like any other, with humanity, in its boundless optimism, looking towards the future. Yet the forces that shape our world, both natural and of our own making, are often unpredictable, and can be terrifyingly powerful. This was a year when the delicate balance between order and chaos was profoundly and repeatedly disturbed across the globe, reminding us of our inherent vulnerability in the face of immense power. Across continents and oceans, the intricate systems that govern our planet's climate and geology were stirring. Deep within the Earth's crust, tectonic plates continued their slow, inexorable journey, building pressures that would soon find violent release. In the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the tropical seas, the conditions were aligning for the birth of monstrous storms, cyclones of unimaginable ferocity. This year would serve as a stark and humbling testament to the fact that we are but passengers on this planet, subject to the immense and often unforgiving forces that have shaped it for millennia. But the tempests were not confined to the natural world. In the complex, ever-shifting landscape of human society, tensions that had simmered for years were also reaching a boiling point. Ideologies clashed, and long-standing grievances threatened to erupt into open conflict, demonstrating that the most destructive forces can sometimes originate not from the earth or the sky, but from within the human heart itself. The year would witness acts of calculated violence that would send shockwaves through communities, leaving scars that would endure long after the physical damage was cleared away, a tragic reminder of our capacity for destruction. This is the story of 2008, a year of profound loss and extraordinary resilience. We will journey to the epicenters of these calamities, from the shuddering mountains of Asia to the storm-battered coasts of the Americas. We will bear witness to the raw power of nature and the devastating consequences of human action. It is a chronicle of disaster, but also a story of survival, of communities shattered and yet, somehow, finding the strength to endure and rebuild in the face of overwhelming adversity, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. In the heart of China lies Sichuan province, a land of breathtaking beauty, where ancient traditions meet the relentless march of modernity. It is a region cradled by mountains, a landscape sculpted over eons by the very geological forces that make it so picturesque. But this beauty conceals a hidden, violent truth. For beneath the serene surface, the colossal Indian tectonic plate grinds relentlessly against the Eurasian plate, an unseen struggle of titanic forces. For centuries, the Longmingshan Fault, a massive fracture in the Earth's crust, had been accumulating stress, a sleeping dragon awaiting its moment to stir from its slumber. On the 12th of May, at precisely 2:28 in the afternoon, that moment arrived. Without warning, the accumulated energy of generations was unleashed in a matter of seconds. An earthquake of magnitude 7.9, a force equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs, ripped through the earth. The ground did not merely shake, it liquefied, it buckled, it tore itself asunder. Entire mountainsides seemed to collapse, and rivers were instantly dammed by colossal landslides. For those on the surface, the familiar solid world they had known their entire lives simply ceased to exist, replaced by a chaotic, terrifying landscape in violent motion. The epicenter was Wenchuan County, but the shockwaves radiated outwards for hundreds of miles, a ripple of destruction spreading across the province and beyond. In cities and remote villages alike, buildings constructed of brick and concrete, symbols of permanence and safety, proved fatally fragile. Schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks, bustling with life just moments before, pancaked into tombs of rubble and twisted steel. The infrastructure of modern life, roads, bridges, power lines, communication networks, was severed in an instant, isolating millions in their moment of greatest need and creating a vast, inaccessible landscape of despair. In the immediate aftermath, a deafening silence fell, punctuated only by the cries of the injured and the ominous rumble of aftershocks that continued to terrorize the survivors. The scale of the devastation was almost impossible to comprehend. What was once a thriving region, home to 80 million people, had been transformed into a disaster zone of apocalyptic proportions. The dragon had awoken, and in its violent thrashing, it had redrawn the map of Sichuan, leaving behind a legacy of ruin and a human tragedy of almost unimaginable scale, a stark reminder of the Earth's untamable power. As the dust began to settle, the true, horrifying extent of the human cost started to become tragically clear. The official figures would eventually speak of nearly 70,000 confirmed deaths, with another 18,000 people listed as missing, presumed buried forever beneath the rubble. But these numbers, staggering as they are, cannot convey the individual stories of loss, the families torn apart, the futures extinguished in a single brutal moment. Each statistic represents a life, a world of hopes and dreams, suddenly and violently erased from existence, leaving behind an unfillable void in the lives of those who survived. The response was monumental, a frantic race against time. The Chinese government mobilized one of the largest rescue operations in history, with soldiers and emergency workers pouring into the region. But the terrain itself was a formidable adversary. Roads that had once wound through mountain passes were now gone, obliterated by landslides. Helicopters struggled to find safe places to land amidst the shattered landscape. For days, many of the hardest-hit areas remained completely cut off from the outside world, their inhabitants forced to rely on their own courage and dwindling resources, digging through debris with their bare hands in a desperate search for loved ones. The aftermath presented a new set of challenges, a crisis of immense proportions. Over 5 million people were left homeless, their lives and livelihoods destroyed. They were now refugees in their own land, gathered in vast makeshift tent cities, facing the threat of disease, the lack of clean water, and the psychological trauma of all they had endured. The earthquake had also created dozens of quake lakes, formed where landslides had blocked rivers. These unstable natural dams posed a terrifying secondary threat, threatening to burst and unleash catastrophic floods upon the already devastated valleys below. The rebuilding of Sichuan would be a task for a generation. It was not just about reconstructing buildings and roads, but about healing a deep, collective wound. The quake left indelible scars, not only on the landscape, but on the psyche of the survivors and the nation as a whole. It was a tragedy that exposed the fragility of human life and infrastructure in the face of nature's might. Yet, amidst the ruins, stories of incredible bravery, sacrifice and resilience emerged, a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit in its darkest hour. Far to the south, in the warm tropical waters of the Bay of Bengal, another natural force of immense destructive potential was gathering strength. In late April, a small, unassuming area of low pressure began to form. Fed by the exceptionally warm sea surface temperatures and favorable atmospheric conditions, it began to organize itself, to rotate, to breathe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it grew from a tropical depression into a storm, and then, with alarming speed, it intensified into a terrifying vortex of wind and rain. It was given the name Nargis. Cyclone Nargis was a storm of rare and terrifying power. As it churned across the open ocean, it drew more and more energy from the warm water, its winds accelerating to sustained speeds of over 200 kilometers per hour. It became a Category 4 storm, a vast, swirling engine of destruction, visible from space as a perfect, menacing spiral of cloud. Its path was tracked by meteorologists around the world who watched with growing dread as it set a course directly for the low-lying, densely populated coast of Myanmar, a nation singularly unprepared for a storm of this magnitude. The Irrawaddy Delta, the Rice Bowl of Myanmar, is a vast, flat floodplain, a labyrinth of rivers, estuaries, and coastal villages. For centuries, its fertile land has sustained millions of people, but its geography, so perfect for agriculture, makes it exquisitely vulnerable to the sea. It is a land with little elevation, offering no natural protection from the fury of an oncoming storm. The people who live here, mostly subsistence farmers and fishermen, reside in simple homes made of wood and thatch, structures that stand little chance against the awesome power of a major cyclone. On the 2nd of May, Nargis made landfall. It did not just strike the coast, it consumed it. The cyclone's ferocious winds drove a colossal wall of water, a storm surge reportedly 12 feet high, deep into the delta. It was not a flood, it was a temporary reclaiming of the land by the sea, an inland tsunami that swept across the flat landscape with incredible speed and unstoppable force. Everything in its path, homes, schools, livestock, and people, was simply washed away, erased from the landscape as if it had never been there. The wrath of the wind had arrived. In the wake of Nargis, a horrifying and almost surreal silence descended upon the Irrawaddy Delta. The landscape had been rendered unrecognizable, transformed into a vast, muddy seascape dotted with the debris of shattered lives. Entire villages had vanished without a trace. The storm surge had penetrated more than 40 kilometers inland, salting the rice paddies and poisoning the freshwater wells. destroying not only the current harvest, but the very means of survival for years to come. The scale of the destruction was biblical, a catastrophe that defied immediate comprehension. The human toll was catastrophic and difficult to ascertain amidst the chaos and the government's initial secrecy. The final death toll is estimated to be over 138,000 people, with tens of thousands more simply listed as missing, their bodies likely washed out to sea or buried deep in the silt. It was one of the deadliest cyclones ever recorded. Survivors clung to treetops or the roofs of submerged buildings, surrounded by a horrifying tableau of death and devastation, waiting for help that was agonizingly slow to arrive in the flooded and inaccessible region. The disaster was compounded by a profound humanitarian crisis. The ruling military junta, deeply suspicious of the outside world, initially refused offers of international aid. For crucial days, as survivors suffered from injury, hunger, and a lack of clean water, vital supplies and experienced disaster relief teams were kept out of the country. This political decision transformed a natural disaster into an even greater human tragedy, leaving millions of its own people to fend for themselves in the most desperate of circumstances, a decision that drew condemnation from across the globe. Eventually, as the sheer scale of the crisis became undeniable, some aid was allowed to trickle in, but the damage had been done. Cyclone Nargis was more than a weather event. It was a tragedy that laid bare the lethal combination of natural fury and political intransigence. It left a nation grieving and a fertile delta scarred and poisoned. For the people of the Irrawaddy, the storm was a singular defining event of immense sorrow, a tide that came in and washed away their world, leaving behind a legacy of loss that would haunt the region for generations. The monsoon. For countless millennia, this seasonal wind has been the lifeblood of the Indian subcontinent, a bringer of rain, renewal, and sustenance. Its arrival is celebrated, its rhythms deeply woven into the fabric of culture and agriculture. But in 2008, this ancient life-giving force would reveal its more formidable, destructive face. The rains came not as a gentle blessing but as a relentless, overwhelming torrent. Across the vast northern plains, the rivers, great arteries of this land, began to swell with an unnatural and terrifying speed, their waters turning from placid blue to a churning muddy brown, laden with the very soil they were meant to nourish. This was not a single isolated event but a creeping, insidious catastrophe unfolding across multiple states. In Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Assam, the familiar landscape began to disappear. Fields of rice and sugarcane, painstakingly planted and tended, vanished beneath the rising tide. Villages that had stood for generations found themselves transformed into isolated islands, their inhabitants watching helplessly as the waters lapped higher and higher against their homes. The very ground beneath their feet, a source of stability and certainty, was liquefying, becoming an agent of chaos and displacement, erasing the boundaries between river and land, safety and peril. The scale of the inundation was difficult to comprehend, a testament to the immense power of water when unleashed. Satellite imagery revealed a landscape rewritten, vast swaths of green and brown replaced by an endless, shimmering expanse of gray. The Great Ganges and its many tributaries, normally contained within their banks, had merged into a single monstrous entity, a temporary inland sea stretching for hundreds of kilometers. It was a primal display of nature's ability to reclaim and reshape the world, a stark reminder that the maps drawn by human hands are merely suggestions, easily erased by the whims of the elements. For the millions caught in its path, the world was reduced to a desperate struggle for survival. The slow, inexorable rise of the water was a constant source of terror, a creeping dread that stole sleep and shattered peace. Every hour brought new anxieties. Would the walls of their homes hold? Where could they find dry ground? How would they secure food and clean water? The familiar sounds of village life were replaced by the incessant gurgle and rush of the flood, a constant, monotonous soundtrack to their unfolding tragedy. It was a test of human resilience against the overwhelming force of a natural world in turmoil. As the waters surged, they swept away more than just homes and crops. They washed away livelihoods, futures, and the very foundations of society. An estimated 30 million people were affected, a number so vast it risks becoming an abstraction. But for each individual, the loss was intimate and absolute. A farmer watched a lifetime of work dissolve into the muddy currents. A shopkeeper saw their inventory, their entire capital, float away. A child's few precious toys were lost to the deluge. The economic devastation was total. a crippling blow to communities already living on the margins of subsistence. The immediate aftermath was a scene of profound desperation. Survivors clung to rooftops, to the tops of trees, to any small patch of elevated ground that offered a temporary reprieve from the relentless waters. They were surrounded by a toxic soup of sewage, agricultural chemicals, and the decaying carcasses of livestock, a breeding ground for disease. Waterborne illnesses like cholera and dysentery began to spread with alarming speed, a second wave of disaster following the first. The cry for help was immense, a chorus of human need echoing across the drowned landscape, often unheard over the roar of the flood. The response was a monumental challenge. Reaching the stranded was a logistical nightmare. Roads were impassable, bridges washed away. Relief efforts relied on helicopters and boats, navigating a treacherous, debris-strewn environment to deliver food, medicine, and drinking water. Every relief package dropped, every person airlifted to safety, was a small victory against the overwhelming odds. But the sheer scale of the crisis meant that for many, help was slow to arrive, their endurance tested to its absolute limit as they waited for rescue, surrounded by an ever-present danger. In the weeks and months that followed, as the waters slowly, grudgingly receded, the true extent of the damage was laid bare. A thick layer of silt and sludge covered everything, a gray shroud over a once vibrant land. The task of rebuilding was daunting, almost impossible to contemplate. Homes had to be reconstructed from scratch, fields cleared of debris and poison before they could be cultivated again. The floods of 2008 were not merely a weather event, they were a profound and lasting trauma, a scar carved deep into the land and the collective memory of its people, a story of survival against the awesome, indifferent power of water. California, a name that evokes images of sun-drenched coastlines and golden hills. But this idyllic landscape holds a deep and ancient relationship with fire. For millennia, flames have swept through its forests and chaparral, a natural and necessary force of renewal. Yet in the summer of 2008, this primordial element was unleashed with a ferocity that defied all precedent. The catalyst was a massive, freakish storm system that rolled across the northern part of the state in late June, a dry lightning event that produced thousands of strikes but precious little rain, acting like a celestial arsonist. The land was primed to burn. Years of drought had left the vegetation tinder dry, turning vast woodlands into enormous pyres awaiting a spark. When the lightning struck, the landscape erupted. Over 2,000 individual fires ignited almost simultaneously, an explosive outbreak of flame on an unprecedented scale. From the rugged coastal ranges to the deep interior of the Sierra Nevada, fires blossomed like malevolent flowers, their plumes of smoke merging into a vast, suffocating blanket that could be seen from space. The state was under siege from within, battling an enemy that was everywhere at once. Firefighters, among the most skilled and courageous in the world, were stretched to their breaking point. They faced a multi-front war with no clear battle lines. As soon as one blaze was contained, another would explode elsewhere, fanned by hot, erratic winds that sent embers flying for miles, starting new spot fires far ahead of the main front. The sound was a terrifying roar, the heat so intense it could be felt from a great distance. It was a battle of human endurance and technology against the raw, untamable energy of combustion, fought in treacherous terrain under a sky choked with smoke and ash. The sheer number of fires created a strategic nightmare. Resources had to be triaged, decisions made about which communities to defend, which wilderness areas to let burn. It was a grim calculus of loss. The Basin Complex fire, the Humboldt Complex, the massive blaze near Big Sur, each was a major disaster in its own right, consuming hundreds of thousands of acres. Together, they formed a mosaic of destruction, a firestorm of historic proportions that blackened the Golden State, leaving its inhabitants to gaze in awe and terror at the sheer unbridled power of the inferno. The human toll of the wildfires mounted with each passing day. Entire communities were forced to evacuate, residents fleeing their homes with only a few moments' notice, carrying their most precious belongings, and the profound uncertainty of what they might find upon their return. The smoke, thick with particulate matter, created a severe public health crisis, forcing people to remain indoors and triggering respiratory problems for thousands. The air itself, the most basic element of life, had become toxic, a constant reminder of the conflagration raging across the state. For those living on the wildland-urban interface where sprawling suburbs push into natural landscapes, the threat was existential. The fires did not discriminate between trees and houses. They consumed everything in their path with a terrifying appetite, reducing homes filled with memories to nothing more than ash and twisted metal. The site of a neighborhood post-fire was one of utter desolation, a monochrome landscape of gray and black where vibrant family life once existed. Each burnt-out foundation was a testament to a life abruptly and violently disrupted. Beyond the human settlements, the ecological devastation was immense. Ancient forests of pine and redwood, ecosystems that had stood for centuries, were incinerated. Wildlife populations were decimated, with animals unable to outrun the speed and scale of the flames. The fires fundamentally altered the landscape, sterilizing the soil in some areas and increasing the risk of catastrophic mudslides when the winter rains eventually arrived. The intricate web of life, so carefully balanced, had been torn asunder, and the recovery, if it came at all, would take generations. In the end, the 2008 California wildfires burned over 1.5 million acres, an area larger than the state of Delaware. They were a stark and brutal lesson in the changing nature of our world. A combination of climate change, which contributes to hotter, drier conditions, and historical fire suppression policies, which allow fuel to build up, had created a perfect storm. The fires were not just a natural disaster, they were a glimpse into a future where the delicate balance between humanity and the forces of nature has been dangerously, perhaps irrevocably, disturbed. In the warm, deceptively calm waters of the tropical Atlantic, a new menace was gathering strength. It began as a mere whisper of wind, a subtle disturbance off the coast of Africa, but as it journeyed west, feeding on the immense thermal energy of the ocean, it grew with terrifying speed. By early September 2008, it had a name, Ike, and it had become a monster, a Category 4 hurricane of immense size and power, a swirling vortex of destruction churning its way towards the vulnerable islands of the Caribbean. Its first major landfall was on the Turks and Caicos Islands. Here, the full, unrestrained violence of the storm was unleashed. Winds exceeding 135 miles per hour screamed across the low-lying archipelago, tearing roofs from buildings as if they were paper and snapping power poles like twigs. But it was the storm surge, the great dome of water pushed ahead of the hurricane, that brought the most complete devastation. It inundated nearly the entire chain of islands, sweeping inland with irresistible force, destroying or damaging over 80% of the homes and leaving the landscape battered and submerged. From there, Ike's unforgiving eye turned towards Great Inagua in the Bahamas, a vital sanctuary for tens of thousands of West Indian flamingos. The storm showed no regard for natural wonders, scouring the island with the same ferocity. Then, it set its sights on the island of Hispaniola, shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In Haiti, a nation already grappling with extreme poverty and the aftermath of previous storms that season, Ike's arrival was catastrophic. The relentless rainfall triggered massive floods and mudslides, washing away entire villages and adding another layer of profound suffering to an already beleaguered population. Cuba, a nation renowned for its meticulous hurricane preparedness, faced one of its greatest tests. Ike raked across the entire length of the island not once but twice, a slow, grinding assault that lasted for days. The storm's immense size meant that virtually no part of the country was spared its wrath. From the historic city of Camagüey to the tobacco fields of Pinar del Rio, the hurricane inflicted enormous damage on infrastructure, agriculture, and housing. It was a demonstration of sheer endurance, a battle between a resilient people and the relentless, punishing force of a truly colossal storm. After its devastating passage through the Caribbean, Hurricane Ike entered the Gulf of Mexico. Here, over the deep, exceptionally warm waters, it did not weaken. Instead, it expanded, growing into a storm of gargantuan proportions. While its wind speeds classified it as a Category 2 hurricane upon its final approach, this number was dangerously deceptive. The true threat of Ike was its sheer size and the catastrophic storm surge it was pushing ahead of it. It was a storm system nearly as large as the state of Texas itself, aimed squarely at the densely populated Galveston and Houston areas. The warnings were dire, the language used by forecasters uncharacteristically stark. They spoke of certain death for those who chose to ignore evacuation orders on the coast. Yet, for many, leaving was not a simple option. Some were stubborn, others complacent, and many simply lacked the resources to flee. As Ike made landfall in the early morning hours of September 13th, their fate was sealed. The Bolivar Peninsula, a narrow strip of land east of Galveston, was effectively wiped off the map, scoured clean by a storm surge that exceeded 17 feet, a wall of water that obliterated everything in its path. The historic city of Galveston, which had rebuilt itself after the calamitous hurricane of 1900, was once again submerged. The famed seawall built to protect the city was overtopped and the surge flooded vast portions of the island. Salt water inundated historic buildings, destroyed businesses, and rendered homes uninhabitable. In the darkness, the sounds were of shattering glass, groaning structures, and the terrifying roar of wind and water. For those who remained, it was a night of pure terror, a primal struggle against a storm that seemed intent on reclaiming the island for the sea. Further inland, the city of Houston, the nation's fourth largest, was battered by hurricane-force winds that shattered the windows of its gleaming downtown skyscrapers, sending glass raining down onto the empty streets below. The storm knocked out power to millions, plunging a major metropolitan area into darkness for weeks. The total damage from Ike would be estimated at over $30 billion, making it one of the costliest hurricanes in United States history. It was a brutal reminder that even in the most modern of cities, society remains profoundly vulnerable to the ancient and awesome power of the atmosphere. High in the Himalayas, where the roof of the world scrapes the sky, great rivers are born. They are the lifeblood of the plains below, nurturing civilizations for millennia. One such river is the Kosi, known in Nepal as the Saptakoshi, for its 7 upper tributaries that converge in a powerful torrent. For centuries it has been both a giver of life and a bringer of sorrow, its course shifting unpredictably across the vast alluvial fan it has built over ages. This river, revered as a mother, carries one of the highest sediment loads in the world, a constant grinding force that reshapes the very land it flows through, a testament to the raw, untamable power of nature. The people of the Kosi Basin in both Nepal and India have long lived in a delicate, often precarious balance with this mighty waterway. They have built their lives, their homes, and their cultures around its seasonal rhythms, understanding its moods and respecting its strength. Embankments and levees, monumental feats of human engineering, were constructed to contain the river's flow, to channel its immense energy, and protect the millions who depend upon its waters for their survival. These structures stood as a symbol of humanity's attempt to impose order on a fundamentally chaotic natural system, a constant negotiation between human ambition and the river's relentless will. But in August of 2008, this long-standing, fragile truce was shattered. The river, swollen by the relentless monsoon rains, was not merely high, it was a furious, churning behemoth. It clawed at its eastern embankment near the Indo-Nepal border, testing the man-made constraints with a force that had been building for decades. The immense pressure of the water, combined with the tons of silt it carried, began to exploit weaknesses in the structure, tiny vulnerabilities that would soon cascade into a catastrophic failure. The river was looking for a new path, an ancient path it had abandoned over 2 centuries ago. And then, it happened. On the 18th of August, the embankment gave way. It was not a gradual erosion but a violent, explosive breach. A torrent of brown, churning water, thick with Himalayan silt, burst through the gap. The Kosi River, abandoning its established channel entirely, surged eastwards, reclaiming a forgotten floodplain with terrifying speed and power. It was as if a geological clock had been rewound, and the river was redrawing the map of the subcontinent in a matter of hours. For the millions living in its new, unexpected path, there was no warning, no time to prepare for the deluge that was about to consume their world. The scale of the inundation was almost beyond comprehension. This was not a flood in the conventional sense, it was the wholesale relocation of a major river system. The water spread out across the densely populated plains of northern Bihar in India, a region known as the country's granary, transforming it into a vast inland sea. Entire villages, fields of ripening crops, roads and railway lines vanished beneath the silt-laden water. The landscape, once a vibrant patchwork of human settlement and agriculture, was erased, replaced by a monotonous, murky expanse that stretched to the horizon. It was a stark and brutal reminder that the forces that shape our planet operate on a scale that can dwarf human endeavor. The human cost was immediate and devastating. People were caught utterly by surprise, swept away in their homes as they slept. Those who managed to scramble to higher ground, to the roofs of their submerged houses or the tops of trees, found themselves marooned in a terrifying new reality. They were isolated, surrounded by a seemingly endless ocean of floodwater, cut off from food, clean water, and any hope of rescue. The cries for help were lost in the roar of the river, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The very fabric of society, the intricate web of communities and families, was torn apart in an instant. As the days turned into weeks, the situation grew ever more desperate. The floodwaters were not receding, they were stagnant, a breeding ground for disease. The initial disaster of the flood was slowly being replaced by a secondary crisis, a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. Millions were displaced, becoming refugees in their own country with nothing left but the clothes on their backs. They huddled in makeshift camps on the few strips of high ground that remained, their faces etched with the trauma of what they had endured and the profound uncertainty of what the future held. The sorrow of Kosi, as the river is known, had lived up to its name. The disaster exposed the profound vulnerability of the millions who live in the shadow of these great Himalayan rivers. Their lives are inextricably linked to the health of the ecosystem and the integrity of the infrastructure designed to protect them. The Kosi breach was a failure of engineering, but it was also a failure to fully appreciate the dynamic and powerful nature of the river itself. It served as a tragic lesson, written in water and silt across the plains of Bihar, that when we attempt to tame nature, we must do so with humility, foresight, and a deep respect for its enduring power to surprise us. The immediate aftermath of the breach was a scene of utter chaos and desperation. As the water surged through Bihar, it left a trail of destruction that was, honestly, difficult to fathom. An estimated 3 million people were directly affected, their lives irrevocably altered by the river's sudden change of course. The challenge for rescuers was immense. With roads and communication lines completely severed, vast areas were simply inaccessible. Helicopters became the only lifeline, dropping food parcels and plucking stranded families from rooftops. But their efforts, though heroic, were really just a mere drop in the ocean of need. The sheer scale of the displacement was overwhelming for local and national authorities alike. The international community responded, but the logistical nightmare of reaching the affected population hampered relief efforts. Aid agencies struggled to navigate the newly formed inland sea, their boats contending with strong currents and submerged debris. The floodwater itself posed a grave threat. Contaminated with sewage, agricultural chemicals, and the decaying remains of livestock, it became a toxic soup. Waterborne diseases like cholera and diarrhea began to spread rapidly through the makeshift camps, preying on a population already weakened by hunger and shock. For many survivors, escaping the flood was only the beginning of their ordeal. The fight for survival had just begun. Repairing the breach was a monumental task. Engineers from both India and Nepal worked around the clock, battling against the river's unabated flow. They had to force the Kosi back into its original channel, a feat akin to redirecting a force of nature. It took months of relentless effort, moving millions of cubic meters of earth and rock, to finally plug the gap and begin the slow process of dewatering the inundated lands. Even as the water began to recede, it left behind a transformed landscape. A thick layer of sand and silt, in some places several meters deep, covered what were once fertile fields, rendering them useless for agriculture for years to come. The long-term consequences of the Kosi flood continue to be felt to this day. Livelihoods were destroyed on a massive scale. Farmers who lost their land faced a bleak future, and countless families were pushed deeper into poverty. The disaster prompted a major re-evaluation of river management strategies in the region, highlighting the need for better cross-border cooperation, improved early warning systems, and more sustainable engineering solutions that work with the river's natural dynamics, rather than simply trying to confine them. The scar on the landscape may have healed, but the scar on the collective memory of the people of Bihar remains a powerful reminder of the year the Mother River turned on her children. Mumbai, a city of dreams, a vibrant, chaotic, and resilient metropolis that is the beating heart of modern India. It is a melting pot of cultures, a hub of finance, and home to the world's most prolific film industry. On the evening of November 26, 2008, the city was alive with its usual relentless energy. Commuters hurried home, tourists marveled at the colonial-era architecture, and diners filled the bustling cafes and grand hotels. There was no premonition, no hint of the meticulously planned and brutally executed storm that was about to break over this sprawling urban landscape. The city, in its confident rhythm, was completely unaware of the terror that was approaching from the sea. Under the cover of darkness, 10 young men, armed to the teeth and trained for urban warfare, arrived on the city's shores in a small inflatable dinghy. They were the vanguard of an assault designed not just to kill, but to paralyze, to terrorize, and to command the world's attention. Splitting into small groups, they fanned out across the southern part of the city, their targets carefully selected for their symbolic value and high concentration of people. These were not random acts of violence, they were the opening moves in a coordinated, multi-pronged siege. The targets included a popular cafe, a busy railway station, a hospital, a Jewish community center, and two of the city's most iconic luxury hotels. The first shots rang out at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, a historic and impossibly crowded railway station. Two attackers walked into the main hall and opened fire indiscriminately with automatic weapons, mowing down men, women, and children. The Grand Victorian architecture, a symbol of Mumbai's history, became a theater of unimaginable horror. Simultaneously, other teams struck elsewhere. At the Leopold Café, a favorite haunt of tourists and locals, a calm evening was shattered by gunfire and grenades. The attacks were sudden, shocking, and incredibly violent, designed to create maximum panic and confusion across a wide area, stretching the city's emergency services to their breaking point. As chaos engulfed the streets, two teams of attackers made their way into the opulent confines of the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel and the Oberoi Trident. These were not just hotels, they were symbols of Indian pride and international prestige. The gunmen moved through the corridors and restaurants with chilling efficiency, taking hundreds of guests and staff hostage. The attack had now evolved from a series of hit-and-run shootings into a protracted siege. The world watched, horrified, as live television broadcast images of smoke and flames pouring from the dome of the iconic Taj Hotel. Mumbai, a city that had endured so much, was now in the grip of a new and terrifying form of warfare. As the last shots fell silent and the smoke began to clear, the true scale of the horror came into focus. The sieges had ended, but the city was in a state of profound shock and grief. The streets of South Mumbai, normally teeming with life, were eerily quiet, littered with the debris of the battle. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the weight of loss. For 3 days the city had been held hostage, its citizens subjected to an ordeal of unimaginable terror. Now, in the quiet aftermath, came the grim task of identifying the dead, tending to the wounded, and trying to make sense of the senseless violence that had been inflicted upon them. The spirit of Mumbai, however, is not easily broken. In the days that followed, a remarkable phenomenon began to emerge. The city, united in its grief, refused to be cowed by terror. Citizens from all walks of life came together in a powerful display of solidarity. They organized candlelight vigils, peace marches, and blood donation drives. Strangers offered comfort and support to one another, transcending the lines of religion and class that so often define Indian society. This was the famous spirit of Mumbai in action, a defiant, resilient response that declared to the world that the city's heart, though wounded, was still beating strong. The attacks had a profound and lasting impact on India's security apparatus and its relationship with its neighbor, Pakistan. Evidence quickly emerged linking the attackers to Lashkar-e-Taiba, a militant group based in Pakistan. The revelation brought the two nuclear-armed rivals to the brink of war. The incident exposed critical gaps in India's coastal security and its counter-terrorism response capabilities. In the years that followed, India undertook a massive overhaul of its security architecture, creating new federal agencies and strengthening coastal surveillance in an effort to prevent a repeat of such a devastating and audacious attack. The legacy of the 26/11 attacks, as they came to be known, is complex. They left an indelible scar on the psyche of Mumbai and the entire nation. Yet they also forged a new sense of unity and resolve. The images of the burning Taj Hotel are now etched in history, a symbol of the terrible violence of that day. But equally powerful are the images of Mumbaikars standing together in defiance. The city did not just rebuild its damaged landmarks, it reaffirmed its identity as a place of courage, resilience, and an unyielding belief in the power of humanity to overcome even the darkest of times. The siege was over, but the spirit of the city endured. Summer in Europe is, usually a time of celebration of those long, languid days and a mass migration to coastlines and countryside. But the summer of 2008 brought with it a different kind of heat. It was not the gentle warmth of a pleasant holiday, but more like an oppressive, suffocating blanket that settled over much of the continent. From Spain to Germany and from Italy to the United Kingdom, weather maps glowed with these angry shades of red and orange. A persistent high-pressure system known as an omega block had stalled over Europe, trapping hot air from North Africa and, preventing cooler, wetter Atlantic systems from moving in. The result was a prolonged and intense heat wave. Day after day, temperatures soared to record-breaking levels. In cities, the effect was magnified. The concrete and asphalt of the urban landscape absorbed the sun's energy, creating a heat island effect that offered no respite, even after sunset. Nights remained uncomfortably warm, preventing bodies from recovering from the stress of the day's heat. Air conditioning units, once a luxury in many parts of northern Europe, were now a necessity, and their constant hum became the soundtrack of the summer, placing an unprecedented strain on national power grids. The very air seemed to shimmer, thick and heavy, and a strange, unnatural stillness descended. This was more than just uncomfortable weather, it was a serious public health crisis in the making. The most vulnerable members of society, the elderly, the very young, and those with pre-existing medical conditions, were at extreme risk. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke became alarmingly common. Hospitals reported a surge in admissions for respiratory and cardiovascular problems, as the extreme heat exacerbated underlying illnesses. The relentless nature of the heat wave, lasting for weeks in some regions, meant that the cumulative stress on the human body was immense. This was a silent, invisible disaster, claiming lives not in a single violent event but slowly and quietly, in apartments and care homes across a continent. Nature too was suffering under the intense solar assault. The lack of rain and extreme heat created tinder-dry conditions across vast swaths of southern and central Europe. Forests and grasslands became highly flammable, and the risk of wildfires soared. Rivers dwindled to mere trickles, their banks baked and cracked. Agriculture was hit hard, with crops withering in the fields under the merciless sun. The heat wave of 2008 was a stark and visceral experience of a changing climate, a glimpse into a future where, such extreme events may become not the exception, but the norm. It was a powerful, continent-wide warning from the planet itself. The consequences of this prolonged period of extreme heat were, profound and far-reaching. While heat waves lack the dramatic visual impact of a flood or an earthquake, their toll is no less severe. The primary impact was on human life. Official figures would later reveal that the heat wave contributed to thousands of excess deaths across the continent. France, which had learned bitter lessons from the catastrophic heat wave of 2003, had implemented robust public health plans, including early warning systems and designated cooling centers, which undoubtedly saved many lives. However, in many other nations, the response was less coordinated, and the silent toll mounted. The economic costs were also significant. The agricultural sector suffered enormous losses. Staple crops like wheat and corn saw their yields plummet, leading to concerns about food security and driving up prices for consumers. The drought conditions affected river transport, with low water levels making some of Europe's major commercial waterways, like the Rhine and the Danube, impassable for large barges. The strain on electricity grids led to localized power outages, further disrupting daily life and commerce. The heat wave was a multi-billion-euro disaster, its impact felt across numerous sectors of the economy. The environmental impact was equally stark. The tinderbox conditions led to a series of devastating wildfires, particularly in countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy. These fires consumed thousands of hectares of forest, destroying precious ecosystems, threatening rural communities, and releasing vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. The low water levels and high water temperatures in rivers and lakes led to a loss of aquatic life, as dissolved oxygen levels plummeted, causing large fish kills. The heat wave was a stress test for Europe's natural environment, and it revealed alarming vulnerabilities. In the wake of the heat wave, there was a growing public and political consciousness about the reality of climate change. The event could no longer be dismissed as a freak occurrence. It was part of a clear and worrying trend of rising global temperatures. The summer of 2008 served as a catalyst for greater investment in climate adaptation strategies, from improving urban green spaces to cool cities, to developing more resilient agricultural practices. It was a sobering experience that underlined the urgent need for global action to curb greenhouse gas emissions. The fever that gripped the continent was a symptom of a much larger planetary illness. As the year 2008 drew to a close, Another kind of storm was gathering, not of wind or water, but of human conflict. In the narrow, densely populated strip of land known as Gaza, tensions that had simmered for decades were about to boil over with ferocious intensity. This was a conflict born of history, of land, and of deeply entrenched grievances. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation, a fragile truce hanging by a thread over a population that had known little but hardship. The world watched, holding its breath as the final days of December ticked by, each one bringing the inevitable confrontation closer to a devastating reality for the millions caught in its path. The immediate trigger was the breakdown of a 6-month ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the governing authority in Gaza. Each side accused the other of violations, a familiar and tragic pattern of escalating provocations. Rockets, primitive yet deadly, were launched from Gaza into southern Israeli towns, sowing fear and demanding a response. In turn, a crippling blockade imposed on the territory tightened its grip, restricting the flow of food, fuel, and medical supplies. For the ordinary people of Gaza, life became an ever more difficult struggle for survival. A daily grind against scarcity and uncertainty, lived under the shadow of an impending military operation. This was a landscape unlike any other we have witnessed. Not a natural ecosystem, but a man-made one, defined by concrete walls, checkpoints, and the ever-present hum of surveillance drones. Here, the struggle for resources was not between predator and prey in the wild, but between neighbors in a deeply divided land. The very fabric of society was stretched to its breaking point. Hospitals struggled to function without reliable power. Families rationed what little they had, and a generation of children grew up knowing only blockade and conflict. It was a pressure cooker, with the heat steadily, inexorably, being turned up. The final days before the storm broke were filled with a tense, foreboding quiet. The rhetoric from both sides grew harsher, more uncompromising. Diplomatic efforts faltered, unable to bridge the chasm of mistrust. The international community issued warnings, but the momentum towards war seemed unstoppable, a force of its own, driven by cycles of violence and retribution. On the 27th of December, the quiet was shattered. The storm had arrived, not with thunder and lightning, but with the roar of jet engines and the percussive blast of explosions that would echo across the tiny territory for weeks to come. The Israeli offensive, codenamed Operation Cast Lead, began with a sudden and overwhelming display of air power. In just a matter of minutes, dozens of targets across the Gaza Strip were struck simultaneously. The initial wave of airstrikes targeted police stations, government buildings, and security compounds, plunging the territory into chaos and confusion. The sky, once a symbol of openness, now became a source of terror. For the civilians on the ground, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide in one of the most densely populated places on Earth. The scale of the initial bombardment was, honestly, breathtaking. Designed to cripple Hamas's infrastructure and its ability to command and control its forces. The days that followed saw the relentless continuation of the air campaign. The sounds of explosions became the constant, terrifying soundtrack to life in Gaza. Homes, schools, and mosques were damaged or destroyed, often with devastating human consequences. The conflict was asymmetrical. One side possessed one of the most advanced militaries in the world, while the other relied on guerrilla tactics and rocket attacks. This disparity was reflected in the casualty figures, which mounted with alarming speed. The humanitarian situation, already dire before the conflict, deteriorated into a full-blown crisis, a catastrophe unfolding in real time. After a week of intense aerial bombardment, the second phase of the operation began, a ground invasion. Israeli tanks and infantry pushed into the northern Gaza Strip and the outskirts of Gaza City, encountering fierce resistance. The fighting moved from the sky to the streets, transforming urban neighborhoods into battlefields. The intricate alleyways and dense buildings of refugee camps became treacherous labyrinths for the invading forces, and deadly traps for the civilians caught in the crossfire. The intimate, brutal nature of urban warfare replaced the detached lethality of airstrikes, bringing the conflict to a terrifyingly personal level for all involved. The humanitarian impact was, frankly, profound and heart-wrenching. With borders sealed and movement impossible, the civilian population was trapped. Hospitals, overwhelmed with casualties, struggled to cope amidst power cuts and a severe shortage of basic medical supplies. United Nations compounds intended to be safe havens were themselves hit. The world looked on in horror as images of the suffering emerged, sparking protests and calls for an immediate ceasefire. By the time a fragile truce was declared in mid-January 2009, much of Gaza lay in ruins, a testament to the destructive power of modern conflict and the immense human cost of unresolved political disputes. In the vast, intricate delta of Bangladesh, the river is life itself. It's the artery of commerce, the source of sustenance, and honestly, the primary highway for millions. Here, great rivers like the Padma, Meghna, and Jamuna converge, creating a dynamic and often treacherous network of waterways that really define the landscape and the rhythm of human existence. For countless people, the daily commute isn't by road or rail, but by boat. Ferries, often aged and invariably crowded, are the workhorses of this aquatic nation, chugging tirelessly from one shore to another, connecting communities and carrying the hopes and dreams of their passengers across the swirling, muddy waters. The MV Coco 4 was one such vessel, a triple-decker ferry that plied the routes of this riverine world. On the 27th of November 2008, it was embarked on a journey that was, for most on board, utterly routine. It was the eve of Eid al-Adha, one of the most important festivals in the Muslim calendar. Families were traveling home to be with their loved ones, carrying gifts and festive cheer. The ferry, designed to carry a certain number of souls, was burdened with many more. Overcrowding on these vessels is a common and commonly accepted danger, a calculated risk in a part of the world where travel options are limited and the need to journey is paramount. The river, however, is an unforgiving force of nature. Its currents are powerful, its depths conceal hidden dangers, and its mood can change in an instant. For the captains who navigate these waters, it demands constant vigilance and profound respect. Yet the pressures of commerce and the sheer volume of human traffic often lead to compromises in safety. Vessels may be poorly maintained, safety equipment may be lacking or non-functional, and passenger limits are frequently ignored. It's a fragile system, operating at the very edge of its capacity, where the potential for disaster is an ever-present, silent passenger on every voyage. As the MV Coco 4 made its way down the Tutulia River in the country's south, it was carrying a heavy burden of humanity, a vessel filled with the joyous anticipation of a holiday homecoming. No one on board could have known that this routine journey was to be its last. The river, which had provided a livelihood and a path home for so many, was about to become their tomb. In the darkness, an unseen and terrible fate was approaching, one that would turn a journey of celebration into a national tragedy, and a stark reminder of the perils that lurk just beneath the surface of these mighty, life-giving waters. The disaster struck without warning in the dead of night. As the MV Coco 4 approached the river landing at Nazirpur, a sudden violent lurch sent waves of panic through the crowded decks. The vessel, already unstable from its excessive load, had reportedly struck a hidden sandbar or another submerged obstacle. The impact was catastrophic. The ferry tilted sharply, its precarious balance lost in an instant. The sounds of festive chatter were replaced by screams of terror as the vessel began to capsize, its lights flickering out and plunging the scene into a terrifying darkness, broken only by the churning of the black water. In the chaos that ensued, the primal instinct for survival took over. Passengers scrambled desperately for an escape, trampling over one another in the pitch-black corridors and stairwells. Those on the upper decks had a fleeting chance, leaping into the cold, fast-flowing river. But for the hundreds trapped below, in the crowded lower compartments, there was no escape. The ferry rolled over, sucking them down into a watery grave. The very structure that had been their transport became their prison, a steel coffin from which the river offered no release. The swift current swept survivors and victims alike downstream into the night. The immediate aftermath was a scene of unimaginable horror and confusion. Local villagers and fishermen, alerted by the screams, rushed to the scene in small boats, pulling whomever they could from the dark water. But their heroic efforts were dwarfed by the scale of the tragedy. As dawn broke, the true, devastating picture began to emerge. The upturned hull of the MV Coco 4 was all that remained visible, a grim monument to the lives it had claimed. Grieving relatives began to gather on the riverbank, their hopeful journeys home transformed into a desperate, agonizing vigil for news of their loved ones. In the days that followed, a massive rescue and recovery operation was launched. Divers bravely entered the submerged vessel, navigating the dark, silt-filled compartments to retrieve the bodies of the victims. The death toll climbed steadily, each recovered body representing a family shattered, a community in mourning. The sinking of the MV Coco 4 became one of Bangladesh's worst maritime disasters, a tragedy born from overcrowding, lax safety regulations, and the inherent dangers of river travel. It was a heartbreaking end to a year marked by so much loss, a final painful reminder of human vulnerability in the face of both nature and our own fallibility. The year 2008 was a year of profound trial. We have journeyed through its darkest chapters, witnessing the awesome, indiscriminate power of the earth and the terrible consequences of human conflict and error. From the trembling ground of Sichuan to the inundated plains of India and Myanmar, from the fires of California to the storm-lashed coasts of the Caribbean, we saw nature in its most formidable guise. And in the streets of Mumbai and the narrow confines of Gaza, we saw humanity inflict its own deep wounds. It was a year that tested the limits of our endurance, a relentless series of calamities that left scars on the global consciousness. Yet, in the midst of this devastation, in the rubble and the floodwaters, another, more enduring force was revealed, the resilience of the human spirit. We saw it in the hands that dug tirelessly for survivors, in the neighbors who sheltered the homeless, and in the quiet dignity of those who had lost everything but their will to carry on. For every story of loss, there was a story of courage. For every scene of destruction, there was a scene of compassion. It is this remarkable capacity to endure, to rebuild and to find hope in the bleakest of circumstances that is perhaps our species' most defining characteristic. The disasters of 2008 are not merely entries in the historical record. They are lessons written in loss and sorrow. They teach us of our planet's power and of our responsibility to understand and respect its forces. They remind us of our shared vulnerability and the urgent need for cooperation in the face of global challenges. They call on us to build stronger communities, to demand safer standards, and to seek peaceful resolutions to our conflicts. To forget these lessons is to dishonor the memory of those who perished, and to risk repeating the failures of the past. As we look back, let us remember not only the scale of the tragedy, but the strength of the response. Let us carry forward the spirit of empathy and solidarity that shone through in those dark times. For it is in our ability to learn, to adapt, and to care for one another that we find the strength to face the uncertainties of the future. The earth will continue to shift, the winds will blow, and the waters will rise. But the human spirit, tempered in the crucible of adversity, has a remarkable capacity not just to survive, but to rebuild, and ultimately to thrive.